The honourable member for Lakeland. I just want to remind members they need to stand so I can know who wants to speak.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate that. In December, while the NDP Liberal self-proclaimed socialist environment minister hung out with 70,000 sanctimonious politicians and wealthy elites at a sprawling air-conditioned steel complex in a major petro state without a hint of shame or irony, I might add, who all flew from around the world on publicly funded commercial and private airplanes and jets, even though virtual attendance was also an option, to scheme up ways to make life poorer, colder, dirtier, slower, darker, more inconvenient, more isolated, more uncomfortable, and more expensive for everyone else. The NDP Liberals colluded to ram through and cover up the pinnacle of their anti-energy, anti-private sector, anti-capitalist agenda here at home. From away, the minister announced yet more damaging policy for Canadians and even bragged that he was the first environment minister in the world out of touch and radical enough to do something to Canada that no other major resource or oil and gas producing country is doing to themselves, no other country in the world at all, in fact, which is to impose a cap clearly designed to function as a Canadian oil and gas production cap, which really means a cap on the biggest private sector investor in Canada's economy, a cap on affordable and reliable power and fuel, a cap on clean tech investment in Canada, which primarily comes from the energy sector, a cap on jobs, on businesses, on tax revenues, for social programs and services for Canadians. That's not leadership. What it is putting one's own radical activist ideology ahead of the best interests of the people he serves, which are supposed to be Canadians. It's not at all worthy of celebration, since no other competing oil and gas producer for which global demand is expected to increase significantly in the foreseeable future is doing to themselves, because they know it's bad for their citizens and bad for their country. Rather, it's entitled, out-of-touch power-mongering and not worth the cost to Canadians. The NDP Liberals don't seem to know or to care that petrostate dictators, terrorists and despots who control and weaponize energy supply against others, and Canada's best ally, customer and biggest oil and gas competitor, the US, are at best shaking their heads at our government's self-inflicted harm on Canadians. Those countries are all ramped up to provide for the world's energy needs, while Canada is home to an abundance of extraordinary resources, expertise, and talent, which is, by the way, leaving in droves for friendlier jurisdictions. But because the NDP Liberals constantly roadblock, gatekeep, hamper, punish, and kill by delay Canadian oil and gas development and exports, rejects every ally who desperately wants and needs Canada's LNG, and their red tape prevents any meaningful production of critical minerals and rare earth metals, since mines can take up to 25 years to get going in Canada. Everything is broken and nothing can get built under these NDP Liberals. When the PM said he wanted to phase out oil and gas, many thought that it was a gaffe, but actually it was a tell, and every action after 8 years shows it. On one hand, it was appropriate that the announcement was there, given that it's exactly global planning gatherings for global economic and foreign policy, like what happens regularly at the annual COP meetings, and many other global policy-focused groups, where this whole concept of the just transition started and where it advances still. On the other hand, it was disturbing because it truly shows how totally out of touch the NDP Liberals really are with the realities of everyday life of the majority of Canadians, and how far away the NDP Liberals are from their long ago empty claims that they value inclusion, diversity, transparency, and most starkly, democracy. The spectacle of the NDP Liberal collusion and cover-up in the Natural Resources Committee to impose the globally planned just transition on Canada and reject nearly all amendments proposed by Conservatives in the early hours of the morning, and to silence and sideline every single Canadian who will be impacted by the costly coalition's anti-energy, anti-private sector agenda embodied in Bill C-50 immediately and in the long run, was almost shocking to witness if it wasn't such a predictable pattern after 8 years. If there was any doubt left, it's more obvious than ever that the NDP Liberals are focused solely on power, not principle, on power, not purpose, on their own partisan, political, and parliamentary power, and on currying favor with their fellow global policy elites, not on the Canadian people, not on the power of the Canadian people, not on the power to the Canadian people. Bill C-50 is the NDP Liberals' behind-closed-doors, top-down central plan for a wide-scale, radical economic restructuring for Canada. And it doesn't even achieve their own stated purpose for their power grab to ram it through. But what else is new with these guys? Because the truth is, there's not a single tangible skills or jobs training program proposed or even outlined in the bill that the Costly Coalition says it's worked on behind closed doors for nearly 2 years. What Bill C-50, which is the global just transition, no matter what the NDP Liberals call it, that is anything but just in every possible way, will do is create a government committee behind closed doors that will create another government committee behind closed doors that will give instructions to governments to centrally plan Canada's economy on a cycle every 5 years. Yes, Soviet-style planning. Every 5 years. That's what Bill C-50 is. And the words are in the title, but Bill C-50 doesn't actually mandate any transparency or accountability about the committees, the costs, the membership, their plans, except for the government to table reports. But they are granted extraordinary power to direct governments to radically overhaul Canada's economy and redistribute wealth. The NDP Liberals also know that their agenda in Bill C-50 will kill over 200,000 jobs in energy and threaten 292,000 Canadian jobs in agriculture, 193,000 Canadian jobs in manufacturing, 642,000 Canadian jobs in transportation, and 1.4 million Canadian jobs in building and construction. Those last two are 10% of Canada's employment alone. That's what the government's own internal memo about Bill C-50, the just transition, means when it cautions about, quote, significant labour market disruptions and, quote, larger scale transformations to jobs and the economy. It's sneaky bureaucratese and parliamentese that's common in government, but its meaning is clear, and it should make every Canadian uneasy. The NDP Liberals even know it will lead to lower paid, more precarious work for Indigenous and visible minority Canadians because it's in the memo. But they should, of course, already know that, since Indigenous and visible minority Canadians work in the energy sector at double the rate of other sectors. But the NDP Liberals don't care. They'll stick with their cruel carbon tax, their energy export ban C-48, their half-a-decade-old unconstitutional C-69. They'll fight for their crazy plastics as toxins decree, even though provinces, Indigenous communities, and entrepreneurs challenge the NDP Liberals on all of those harmful anti-energy agendas and energy policies through federal court and to the Supreme Court. The NDP Liberals, of course, know that some Canadians will be hurt more than others. People in Newfoundland and Labrador, in Saskatchewan and in Alberta, they will be, quote, disproportionately affected, but the NDP Liberals don't care. Bill C-50 will build central planning ideological bureaucracy, not Canadian skills training programs. Bureaucracy, not Canadian jobs. Bureaucracy, not Canadian businesses. Bureaucracy, not Canadian clean tech. So Canadians might be wondering what the heck's going on here. Well, the truth is the NDP Liberals cooked up Bill C-50 behind closed doors for about 2 years, introduced it last summer with a last-minute spin job, name change, and no debate. Before the committee even reported on what, in hindsight, was clearly a collusion charade to appear to help create the legislation in the first place, they brought it back in the fall, shut it down with less than a normal business day of debate for all MPs, spent a month obsessed with blocking Conservative MPs at committee, and censored any MP and any Canadian with a different view, or even with any reasonable questions about their plan, which they imposed through a top-down edict from the House of Commons, which was, by the way, used only twice in urgent scenarios in 9 years under the previous Conservative government, but at least 10 times by the Costly Coalition. So let's talk about the kinds of amendments that were rejected that Conservatives proposed. We proposed, quote, measures to ensure access to affordable and reliable energy, ensure a strong export-oriented energy sector, avoid regulatory duplication and necessary delays, outline how the federal government will help ensure the affordability and reliability of energy, improve affordability and to facilitate and promote economic growth, private sector investment, the creation of sustainable jobs, ensure that major and clean energy projects under federal regulatory frameworks can be delivered on time and on budget, the importance of collaborating with all levels of government, including provincial, territorial, and municipal governments, and all relevant partners and stakeholders, the inclusion of representatives of provincial, territorial, and Indigenous governance bodies, measures to recognize local and regional needs, including Indigenous communities, ways to create economic opportunities for Indigenous communities, ways to promote economic growth, including the economic growth of Indigenous communities, mandate meaningful consultation to account for the cultural values, aspirations, strengths, and to include at least 2 members who represent Indigenous organizations, at least one of which was a substantial interest in Canada's natural resources sector. They even rejected an amendment where Conservatives called on achieving a fair and equitable plan.
I'm sorry, the honourable member's time is up. I've been signaling her.